Hello, good morning. This is week number 8 of our class on American Church History. And we have discussed last week about the colonial period. But before we go into the actual colonial period in America itself, we need to go back a little bit to 16th century to see how about 100 years of brewing of this movement has affected the development of Puritans eventually to make that decision to come to United States, the land of America at the time. So there were, after Reformation, there's a movement called Enlightenment. So Reformation against the Catholic Church, having to begin to have the Protestant theology and the movement separating themselves, the Catholic, on the that's a religious front, meaning the Christian faith. But in the secular area, in the time of Europe at the time of the Reformation, so-called secular is very minimal force. But with the Renaissance and these things, there is that kind of different, who has a different idea about the religion, about Christianity. And there's a movement called Enlightenment. But Enlightenment, as I told you, it was not limited only to the field of secular philosophers or secular culture, but it spilled into religion as well. And there are some people who begin to think in the way of reason. So they begin to reason and say, as people think and reason and argue and question, a person to be reasonable, he or she begin it by asking questions. So there are some people who are within the Christian circles, within Catholic, and especially within the Reformation circles, and within the Anglican Church, Lutheran Church, there were ones who begin to ask a question. Because the Enlightenment says we are human beings and we are valuable, we have right. This idea of right and freedom is the key to the movement Enlightenment and Renaissance. So with that idea of right and freedom, they apply that idea to the field of religious practice and say, are we doing it right? Begin to ask a question. Is the Anglican Church, is it right church? Is it Lutheran church? Is that the only church that we need to belong? And that's because of that. There are people who doubt, begin to question the authority and the way of worship and so on. And naturally, the authorities, whether it's a church leaders or political leaders, when they find those who are having different ideas and thoughts and ideologies and who are beginning to ask questions, they begin to suppress. I mean, that's the nature of the the power. Especially when they are just minorities, they ignore, not only ignore, I mean, they try to pressure them so they can go away, disappear. So that same thing happened in European church. But these are some of the names of these people who begin to kind of ask questions against the existing authority. So it not only happens within the political field, it does happen with the religious field. And we have discussed who these are. But basically, these are people who began to ask questions to the state church, the authority, church leaders, the existing system. You know, always in the history, there are people who ask this question against existing system. Because usually the existing system try to stay without change. They try to, make it more solid and strong. And then they have corruption with them. And then corruption, again, it increases and strengthens the corruption. And the system gets more solid. And it doesn't want to change. And then we come to Congregationalist. This is a very key and important development in understanding the American churches, especially the Baptists. No, in the world, the Southern Baptist is the largest denomination globally, of course in America as well. And the Southern Baptist and most of Baptist churches are Congregationalist. Who they are is, what their philosophy, what they believe about the church is quite different from what they believed at that time. State church is only legal, valid church they acknowledge at the time, like the 16th century and 17th century. If in England, the Anglican Church was the church, and there's no other church allowed. And the Congregationalism says, it's a theological position or doctrinal position saying somewhere between Presbyterianism and radical Protestantism of the Baptists and Quakers. What it is, let's go. It emphasized the right and the responsibility of each properly organized congregation to determine its own affairs without having to submit these decisions to the judgment of any higher human authority, and as such it eliminates bishops and presbyteries. So the bishop and the presbyteries are the higher authority that rules over the church, even within the Protestant faith, Protestant church. So the Anglican Church and Lutheran Church, they had the bishops and the presbyteries who rule over each individual single local churches. So each local church was called a congregation. It is still called a congregation. Congregation is actual people who gather to worship in a given location and in a given time under a pastor or priest, whoever leads their worship. So that's the smallest unit of a church at the time. For today, there are small groups as well, but at the time, the presbytery, and then there are local churches. Presbytery is the authority over these small churches. They kind of gather these churches and exercise certain authority and the direction over these local churches. But the Congregationalist says we are going to exercise our own right and freedom. Again, this issue of freedom and right, from individual personal freedom and personal right, they are saying each congregation we have right to exercise and make our decision about the issues regarding our own church, and we have that freedom. You cannot tell us what to do and what to believe and how to worship. See, these are the main the topic of discussion or main issue, the problems. So people, the Congregationalists, they wanted to have their own right and freedom to worship the way they want and believe what they want to believe. Each individual church is called the local church today. This local church today is regarded as an independent and autonomous. So the key word is here autonomous. Autonomous is having own right and freedom. Whether it's a person, whether it's a group, whether it's a church, whether it's a business, whether it's a school. The school that we studied together, the Lordland College, is a very autonomous institution. We make our own decisions. But there are certain regulations by the government, but still, this is an autonomous institution. So again, this adding to the list, pietists, these are the people who believed, had the issue with the what to believe. The state church tries to tell them to believe this is the doctrine, this is our theology, you should not believe something else. The pietist says, I don't want to, practice certain rituals, but we want to focus on the belief itself. And they had the different rituals, different styles. And the Anabaptists had a issue with the baptism, infant baptism. So they wanted to baptize the adults, and that's go against the policy of the state church. So actually they had the trouble and conflict with the state church in believing what to believe and how to practice that. So they wanted to have adults to confirm their faith and then be baptized again. The separatists, they wanted to separate themselves from the Presbyterian church. And the church would not, they would not allow that to be the case. So there are people who want to separate themselves, and then church says, no, you cannot separate you guys. It has to do with the right and freedom. Next, the Puritans. Okay, these are the ones that we need to focus, because the Puritans are the first ever religious group, or the long time settlers, so-called settlers, who came to America to settle and to live forever in this land. So these are the Puritans. They are in the line of these movements. Okay? The Puritans were members of a religious reform movement known as Puritanism. Puritanism is what that arose within the Church of England. So this happened in England, the Church of England, or Anglican Church. In the late 16th century, they believed the Church of England was too similar to the Roman Catholic Church and should eliminate ceremonies and practice not rooted in the Bible. So the word Puritan comes from that they want to be pure to the biblical teaching. So the key word here is biblical teachings. They didn't want to exercise something that is not in the Bible. So it's about the so that becomes the issue at the time, the style, rituals, and practices the Roman Catholic Church had exercised. It is still there in the Church of England. They separated themselves from the Pope, but the way they believe, the doctrine they believe, was not changed. Because in the Europe, other than England, whether it's a Zwingli or the Luther or Calvin, they are the ones who focused more on the doctrine first than the practice and rituals, the style. And when we study a culture or the way the people live. This is very important, a key element in understanding of culture as you try to analyze it. And whether it's a religion, politic, or your home life, or your social life, there's always something called meaning and form. Form is something that's visible, just like a style, practice, rituals, and so on. The way we dress, this is a form. But sometimes the form, and not sometimes, always, these forms does have meanings. Now you may not be able to see, but in this classroom there's a cross, wooden cross hanging right behind on the back side of the classroom. So that this cross is wooden cross is a symbol and is a form, but it means the Jesus, and it means the redemption, it means the death, and also it means the resurrection. The Protestant churches does not have Christ Jesus on the cross because we believe more on the resurrection side. But the Catholic churches, they put Jesus on that cross, hanging, which more emphasize on the suffering of Jesus. So that's kind of a symbol, it's a meaning. And the form and meanings is two sides of a culture. The reason that I'm telling you this is Puritans, they look at this form. But the thing is, what troubled them is the teachings, the doctrines, the theology of Church of England or Anglican Church is pretty much the same as the Catholic Church. There's nothing has changed actually, except they are politically separate from the Pope. Now instead of Pope, the Queen or King of England is on the top of this Anglican Church, or the bishop of the Church of England is on the top of it instead of Pope. So it's actually the same they thought. And the thing is, the meaning part, they are far away from the biblical teachings they know. As they read and study the Bible, they find out what they have been taught is not what the Bible teaches. See, this is I told you, the Enlightenment, the movement of general movement of Enlightenment helped the Christians to be able to study and read. Not many were able to read before the Reformation, but now there's more people who are able to read, and then there's so-called translation of Bible. So if you're not able to read and understand the Latin, then you are not able to understand the Bible, even though you can write and read English. But now, many people in England were educated thanks to the Enlightenment movement, and they are able to now read and understand what the Bible teaches, and they find out the Bible does not teach some of the things that the Roman Church or the Church of England are teaching them and forcing them to do and practice. So the right and freedom, again, unlike idea of Renaissance and Enlightenment, does affect So Puritans say, we want to believe and we want to practice as we find that in the Bible. And the Church of England says, no, you cannot. You cannot. That's against the church, the state church. Puritans felt that they had a direct covenant with God to enact these reforms. Under siege from church and crown meaning the queen or king, the authority, certain groups of Puritans migrated to northern English colonies in the New World in 1620s and 1630s, laying the foundation for the religious, intellectual, and social order of New England. Aspect of Puritanism have reverberated throughout American life ever since. So the historical, comment says, so Puritans decide to migrate, move to, or become refugee actually. They become refugee to America. Who wants to leave the country and the culture they are so familiar with and lived so long, and all the friends and families? See, we don't want to migrate unless there has to be a good reason for it, right? And then Puritans find the reason, and it's not. They favored to leave their own country, but they had to because of oppression from the church. Can you understand that? Oppression from the church. And it actually happened, and it happens more often than as you may imagine. A Catholic Church, they did oppress the people, their own congregation as well. And even today, we see the oppression from the church happening. It's happening in the church. It is sad, but it is happening. So that's the Puritans. Now, so as these Puritans come as refugees to America and begin settle down, and 10 years, 20 years later, there are other people other than Puritans coming into America, the New England, so-called the New England. That's the northeastern part of the United States of America. As you see the map, there's the New England. So Maryland, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and so on. Those are the so-called New England, first 13 states. See, they become so-called British America, becomes actually the colony of Britain or the England. See, this is an irony. The first people in America come as a refugee to avoid the persecution and oppression from the Church of England, and they came to exercise their right and freedom. So they move away and they think they'll be, free from their mother country. Now, after just a few years, the land becomes a colony. First settlement happens 1607 in Virginia, the Plymouth. The Pilgrims, the Puritans called the Pilgrims because they take a pilgrimage from their own land. And pilgrims are the ones who travel for the reason of religion, right? That's pilgrims. And so they call them the pilgrims. And but by 1760, there are 2 million settlers in the New England. Wow, quite an increase. So this portion of America becomes the British colony, or British America, and this period we call British America. It's before the independence of America. Okay, let's take a look at the Pilgrims. These are the those Puritans who came to Plymouth, Massachusetts, not Virginia. I'm sorry. This Virginia 1607. No. Okay, the Pilgrims were the English settlers who came to North America on Mayflower. This is the name of the ship, and established the Plymouth colony in what is today known as Plymouth, Massachusetts, named after the final departure port of Plymouth. So they left the Plymouth in England, the port of Plymouth in England, and came to the America, and then named that place as Plymouth later on. Their leadership came from the religious congregations of Brownists, or the Separatist Puritans. See, these are the Puritans. So within the Puritans, even within the Puritans, there are several smaller groups who differ from one to another, who had fled religious persecution in England for the tolerance of 17th century Holland in the Netherlands. So, see, they find some other European countries exercising or giving the right and freedom to worship. And then in the England, they didn't see that. And instead of going to Netherlands, some of them did move to Netherlands for the freedom of worship. And some of them are called Anabaptist in Netherlands as well. But see, they decide to come to a new world, less civilized, and they have to start everything new. But they took that risk. So this is what pilgrims might look like. I mean, they didn't have the picture, a photograph at the time. So this is a kind of imagination of artists, but it's very historically correct. So that's how they looked like at the time of arrival. Then Puritans again. They held many of the same Puritan Calvinist religious beliefs, but unlike most other Puritans, these Puritans, they maintained that their congregation should separate from the English state church, which led to them being labeled separatists. So the Puritans are the kind of, or one of separatists. So we see this, kind of trend. So mainly it has to do with the state church, who is trying to force their doctrine and their political agenda to the these people. They don't want anything that's against them, and then these Puritans were against it. They eventually determined to establish a new settlement in the New World and arranged with the investors to fund them. They established Plymouth Colony in 1620, where they erected Congregationalist churches. So the first Congregationalist church, first church in America, which was established by Puritans who had arrived in the Plymouth Colony in 1620. They are the ones who began the church as the Congregational Church, Congregationalist Church. It is different from the today's so-called Congregational Church, which is a denomination, but they do carry the same doctrine and theology about the church. So they believed church needed to be separated from the state. Okay, let's take a short break and let me come back. Okay, we are back, and so again, the first church in America is Congregationalist church, meaning the church, they believe that the church, the local church, is the unit where they can exercise their own freedom and their own right in running and planning and ministering on their own. I mean, you are not to be told by bishop or presbyteries to what to do and what not to do. So that was their idea. That's why they moved to America, all the way across Atlantic, risking their lives. Now, one of the very significant events that we still, remember and celebrate is Thanksgiving. Of course, they did not have Thanksgiving tradition in Europe, but there is something similar. There were those harvest festivals in many different countries in Europe, and within, their own culture. They had a culture of celebrating the fall harvest. Now, it is a little different in the New England, the first settlement in America. First settlement in America it was not like a secular population like we understand today. They are just religious group. They're totally, purely religious group. The Puritan, the separatist, and the Congregationalist. They were accustomed to regularly celebrating Thanksgivings, days of prayer, thanking God for blessings such as a military victory or the end of drought. So, after the first Thanksgiving, this kind of becomes a tradition that is unique to these Puritans or pilgrims. And they not only celebrated the harvest, but also had this Thanksgiving ritual, this kind of ritual or the practice after military victory or even end of drought. But the initial Thanksgiving, the event that Americans commonly call the first Thanksgiving, was celebrated by the Pilgrims after their first harvest in the New World in October 1621. So as they arrive in 1620, they just face severe winter. I mean, you know that the winter in New England today is pretty cold. It's pretty cold. And then they did not have much to, survive. The food ran out, and then they didn't have a house they didn't have time to build a house yet. And so many has died from the hunger and the cold that year. And then first harvest was actually seen in 1621, the next year. This feast lasted 3 days, and as recounted by attendee Edward Winslow, was attended by about 90 Wampanoag and 53 pilgrims. These are the local Native Americans. So 90 local Native Americans plus 53 pilgrims who had survived the severe winter to the next fall, October. Yeah, this is a kind of picture of first Thanksgiving. I say imaginary. They didn't paint at the site. It's kind of later imagination of artist. But that's what it might look like at the time, the first Thanksgiving ever. Because they were godly people, devoted, and then came to state as a refugee, religious refugee, and there's more reason for them to, come to God, to thank and to celebrate in the name of faith, the belief. And that's how America began. We need to remember, because the history of church, history of America, basically in the beginning, it's a history of church, a history of believers. And now look at America, it's much different. So, that's how the history is. But that's how the human beings are. It wasn't so later that the secular influence and the secular people, kind of came and destroyed the purity of that society and community. So as we see this, we can say this is a pure, faithful community of God. Of course, there must have been some troubles and issues of their own, but compared to this secular culture and society. They has been very devoted and pure. And only this colonial America, or so-called British America, there are some of the issues. The Pequot War. Pequot is a war against Native American. So as settlers come in, first settlers try to live in harmony with the native people. Even the 90 so-called Indians or Native American. I rather use Native American rather than Indians, because Indians are very mistaken identification of the people. So these Native Americans, the original settlers, or they are the owners of this land. They try to live in harmony because these people know they're a refugee and they're kind of guest to this country, and there are original settlers who has the ownership of the land. They knew they are renting this land from the original owners, and they are doing the favor to them. So that was kind of position the first settlers were in. But as they add some other settlers, especially this secular kind of money seeking, power seeking, fortune seeking people, they begin to have conflict with the American Native American people. So who's at the wrong in this case? I mean, look at the history. If we come and try to invade, who's wrong? The invaders, of course. But many historians, past historians, did not try to write in that kind of manner. And interpretation of understanding of so-called Pequot War, and then later this trouble with the Native Americans, they did not write a balanced history. So here we need to reinterpret and see what the position is. The invaders are taking arms and the sword against the native people who are living in peace, and they came in and tried to fight because they want to have the land, and they are trying to take away the land from the Native American people. So this is a very significant event about this controversy, or actually the word controversy is not the correct word in this case. It's conflict. Actually, it's conflict. It's not controversy. And Anne Hutchinson is a woman who has been burnt for her faith. In America, it's not in Europe, it's in America. So again, they came for the right and the freedom of their own faith and religion. And they are persecuting, some of them are begin to persecute their own people for the reason of different faith. This is a famous so-called witch trial. Witch is the Satan, evil inspired woman is called witch. So when they say witch, it's actually a religious term. And it's not only not Christian, they say this woman is possessed by the evil spirit. That's why they judge and then kill. So the question is, does the church has a right to make that kind of judgment and to even to exercise the killing of a person for the reason of faith? So that controversy has to say a lot. The many of those who participated in the war against the Native American later on, and it's not at the initial, it's not the initial pilgrims who did that, but later on the settlers, migrants who came in from the Europe, they are the ones who begin to kill and massacre these Native Americans. And sadly, many of them, even though it might not be a majority, but many of them are still, they are so-called Christians. And then these Christians are killing other people because they have different skins, and then they are the ones who are resisting against their progression, so-called. So that becomes a major controversy, or the political issues that need to be interpreted. But at the time it was justified in many ways, but today you cannot justify this. So that is the issue. Yeah, here's a picture showing how these white people become aggressive and raise their arms and the swords and begin to kill the native people. So here's an explanation, or a brief summary of what actually had happened. An armed conflict that took place between 1636, so it's about 16 years later, as the first settlement began in 1620. So 1636 and 1638 in New England, between the Pequot tribe and an alliance of the colonists of the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Saybrook colonies, and their allies from the Narragansett and the Mohegan tribes. So not only they go against one of the tribal people, the Native Americans, but they kind of joined with other American Native people, the tribes, to kill one of their own. Even though they are different tribes, still they are American Native people. So sadly, because of these white people coming from the Europe, they put tribe against tribe. See, that's what happens when people become greedy and people become egoistic, whether they are Christian or not. So can we say that they are true Christians? Okay, so that's the question we struggle with. how can they justify these kind of behaviors and mischiefs, and then killings, murder? Eventually it ends up as a Pequot or Pequot Treaty. The war concluded with the decisive defeat of the Pequot. They did not have guns, and so I mean, if you're trying to fight against these white people who had guns and the long sword, the arrows and the spear cannot protect them. So at the end, about 700 Pequot had been killed or taken into captivity. Hundreds of prisoners were sold into slavery to colonists in Bermuda or the West Indies. Other survivors were dispersed as captives to the victorious tribes. So this is very far from what we call paradise or peaceful community or society. So this white settlers from Europe is making an enemy against the people who already lived here in peace. Not only that, they are trying to make these tribe against other tribe. Of course, there has been some, enmity going on against these tribes, but they use that conflict to gain their own benefit. See, that is evil. That is wrong. And some of them are Christians. So the church, now the American church is not, free from these events. And many years, 100 years, the church had failed, American church had failed to acknowledge their responsibility on these histories, these events. And see, that is sad. And the whole community, the Pequot, was destroyed for the reason of trying to protect their own land, their own freedom, their own right, and own dignity. See, these people came for their own right and freedom. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them who came later, they did not have that ideal, or maybe used this right and freedom and think of their own right and freedom and dignity and forget or ignore about someone else's freedom and right. Unless they think or they believe these Native Americans are less than human beings or even less than animals they cared for, then this might be possible. This might be possible. They did not felt any guilt at all. But if they thought, any of them thought they are also the human being as well, even though their skins are different, their culture is different, they worship some other gods, still they're the human beings, need to be protected and need to be respected. but they did not. So this is a very important lesson for us today as a Christian and as an American church. See, we cannot justify this with any theology or doctrine, you cannot. And need to acknowledge and then take a lesson. And then also need to do every effort possible to remedy or compensate or whatever. Repent of those things. Now, another very, I would say, ironic event in early American church history under British, America is Anne Hutchinson trial, and this is also the picture of what might look like, and that the lady there in the center, she is Anne Hutchinson. We don't know exactly how she looked like, but it happened in July. So, she was born in July of 1591 and killed in 1643 in American soil. Was a Puritan spiritual advisor and a religious reformer and an important participant in the antinomian controversy which shook the infant Massachusetts Bay colony from 1636 to 1638. So look at that year. It's the same year when the Packet War was going on. Her strong religious convictions were at odds with the established Puritan clergy in the Boston area, and her popularity and the charisma helped create a theological schism, the separation, that threatened to destroy the Puritan religious community in New England. She was eventually tried and convicted, then banished from the colony with many of her supporters. Banished, no longer exist. There's no record about what happened actually, but we can guess. Easily guess that she, after trial, she has been convicted, and then must be killed, right? Now the thing is, the Puritans are the ones who fled from the England for the right and freedom to worship. Now here's a lady, Hutchinson, who's trying to worship the way she wants to worship. And the Puritans, they are making the judgment, putting her on trial, and then putting her to death, probably. So we don't know actually what happened, but as you read the story of Ku Klux Klan and all these things still going on, she might be secretly killed with other supporters. So, as the human nature, the evil in us, even with the Christian community, this had happened, It is still happening, and it will be happening in the future. So the lesson from these two controversies or events, very, very odd and unlikely event that happened to the Puritan community in Massachusetts, we know the church does fail sometimes, and actually many times, because the church is not perfect. Church is not perfect. It will never be perfect until Jesus comes back and establish his perfect church on earth with a new earth and new heaven. But until then, we struggle. We keep trying, knowing that we may fail, just like that lessons in history. So there are some people who say, why try? I mean, and it's all lies and hypocrites and so on, making judgment and fingering the Christians. But we know. We still struggle, and we try our best to live according to biblical teachings. But there's always that danger and risk of our human ego and human thoughts, and that very selfishness come into the practice and exercise and of the Christian life, so-called. Now, another development that happened within the British America in the early development of America within first 30, 40 years or so is the denominations. Because of this congregational idea or separatist idea, the local churches, local congregation becomes the very, very basic and the fundamental unit for a church. In their paradigm, church paradigm, there's no longer something called that pyramid kind of Catholic church, or the national church or state church. They just forget about it and try to forget about it. And then as a result, there is something called denominations. Denomination means divisions, small segment, small compartment. So already there are some denominationism, or the movement of multiple denomination that are happening from Europe. But actually this Lutheran and Anglicans, you may consider that as a denomination, but still, in the true meaning of denomination cannot be applied to this Presbyterianism, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and so on, against the Catholicism. So there, Catholics called these new Protestant as a denomination. So the name is used for them, but true denomination is within it's not. My question is, can we say that a state church as a denomination? Think about it. Okay. Then if yes, then that's a denomination. Anglican Church is one denomination. Lutheran Church, one, and then Presbyterian Church in Switzerland, the Calvin is one denomination. So the denomination becomes a trend, and in America there is so-called indigenous denomination that arises as a result of all this trend that is going on. So yeah, I think it's the time's up, and we'll continue to look at these denominationism and then denominations and how that affect the landscape of church in America. We'll see that in next week. So thank you again for your good attention, and have a good day, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.